Okay, today we are talking about the CAMRT consent. Now, the CAMRT is the Canadian Association of Medical Radiography Technologists. That is our national governing body when it comes to X-ray technologists. The reference can be found for this information on the CAMRT website there. So, what we want to do is we want to ask ourselves, what is an informed consent? Okay, so an informed consent really is regarding a consent that's required for a procedure or a particular treatment that has any kind of risks that potentially could occur or complications to the patients. So in order to make sure that the patient understands what they are consenting to, we have an explanation of that procedure itself, and also to an opportunities provided to the patient to allow them to ask questions. Okay? Failure to obtain an informed consent may be considered negligent under the current Canadian law. So it's very important we understand what makes the consent valid and why we go through that process in order to make sure that the patient does completely understand what they are consenting to. So in having said that, if we look at what makes a consent valid, first off, the patient needs to be legally competent. Okay? Now that can be a little bit challenging at times to determine if perhaps the patient does understand what they are signing. Perhaps it could be due to English as a second language, or they're medicated, okay, so their judgment, their cognitive thinking could be decreased or compromised. Perhaps they are suffering from different types of illnesses or pathologies such as Alzheimer's or dementia. So in order to make sure that the patient is competent, there are steps that are taken to follow to make sure that that is the case. Okay? It is important that the patient does receive a full and proper disclosure of information. That includes the risks and the benefits for undergoing the procedure or the treatment itself from the technologist who's going to be participating in administering that different exam or procedure. When we talk about proper disclosure, we do not want to omit any kind of information that is going to be occurring. So in other words, we don't leave anything left to assumptions. Okay, if a patient has inquiries regarding post-procedural, etc. like that, we have to disclose that information prior to them signing the consent. So for instance, if someone was having to drive or felt they could go back to work afterwards and they couldn't, well then that would be something that they were not informed or it wasn't properly disclosed to them. Okay, the consent needs to be specific about the treatment. So in other words, if you had the patient sign a consent and it stated that this was the type of procedure or treatment, and then it ended up being not the procedure, or there was a modification, that has to be included, and the patient needs to be made aware of that prior to still complying with the procedure or the exam itself. Okay? All right? The consent needs to be what's considered voluntary. And voluntary sounds simple enough, right? I mean, the procedure is done in the hospital, the patient's in the hospital, but this is particularly important when it comes to an inpatient, okay, a patient who is admitted into the hospital per se. And perhaps there are occasions where, the patient's not really sure if they want to necessarily have this particular exam or procedure, but they are influenced or they are pressured by perhaps their family, or maybe they feel that they have to do it because that's what their doctor has ordered. So please try to make observations from the patient when you are going over the consent and ensuring that they understand everything completely, that it truly is a voluntary consent that is being given. Okay? Informed consents are based on accurate representation of the relevant information. So only include the information that really is relevant, okay? And when it comes to answering questions, it's very important that if you do not have an understanding of how to answer that question, or your experience or knowledge hasn't yet reached that level, please, please, please do not hesitate, but to say, you know what, I need to check that out, I will get back to you, and proceed from there, okay? Please do not just kind of answer and think that, oh yeah, it's probably something like that, okay? I mean, that's where we talk about specific and accuracy, okay? All right. Now, who can give the consent? If a patient is capable of giving the consent, please look at the CAMRT website that says what is an informed consent tab, all right? and they will give you an idea of what it is that considers the criteria for a patient being able to give you that consent, as I mentioned, that step by step. If the patient is incapacitated of giving a consent, then a substitute decision maker can be provided. Okay, often you'll hear about a power of attorney or a medical director. Please note, though, that this is a provincial legislation. So in Alberta, we have different legislation as far as who can give consent versus, say, BC or Saskatchewan. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that often, loved ones, whether they're family members or friends, are more than willing to sign on behalf of patients unless they are and provide documentation that they are the legal guardian or that they are the medical director or the power of attorney. They typically are not allowed to sign the consent on behalf of the patient. That is a little bit different when it comes to spouse or partners, but again, too, that will vary based on the provincial legislation itself. Okay, the patient's physician or another family member of the healthcare team cannot give consent on behalf of the patient unless that patient is deemed incompetent. Okay, then that's the exception, and unfortunately there's always exceptions, but that is one of the exceptions where a physician may be allowed to sign on behalf of the patient. An example of that would be if a patient came into emergency and they needed basically an exam or a test that could make a difference about their diagnosis or the outcome of their treatment, then often the ordering physician will sign, and then again, too, that is something that is discussed and consulted with the emergency physicians and the other individuals involved. Okay, all right. In these cases, the physician may give the order to proceed with the procedure if that has been decided. The facts and the circumstances surrounding the decision to proceed without informed consent must be carefully documented. Okay, so in other words, if a radiologist and an emergency physician have deemed this and made the decision that this procedure or this treatment needs to be done, then the particular details as far as the name of the physician and the name of the radiologist, etc., all of that must be documented. Okay, and it needs to be documented at the time. So there's not kind of, I know at times in those situations we tend to go, okay, I'll get that done later. No, please do not do it later. Document it at the time and be very clear as far as the details as to, was it a phone conversation? Was it something that perhaps, sorry, the mosquitoes are really bad here right now. But please document any particular or relevant details. For ongoing or repeated procedures of a treatment. So if someone is a patient, for example, of pain management, okay, it is reasonable to obtain informed consent at the initial visit and to interpret the patient's conduct. So for instance, if their initial visit was a week ago and then they were scheduled again for a secondary or what's the word I'm looking for? A follow-up appointment, that consent could be considered continuous. Okay, all right, so you can, because they have already been informed of the different consequences and the risks involved with that. Consent, but never hesitate to ask if they have any additional questions and to ask if there is any information they wish to share as well as far as that initial visit. Consent to, a patient may obtain consent may be withdrawn at any time. Okay, keep in mind, if English isn't the patient's first language, in the hospital there are translators, okay, and please access those services. The Alberta Health Services, in fact, has over 240 or something like that. It's a huge number of how many translators they have. So really, it may take a bit more time, but it's well worth the effort, because we would much rather the patient, of course, not only understands the procedure, but doesn't decide to withdraw their consent because they feel as though they have not been accurately or properly informed. Okay? The patient can withdraw the consent at any time they want. So if you are all set up, ready to go, and the radiologist comes in and the patient all of a sudden says, nope, I can't do this, I don't want this done, then that's before the procedure. It's well within their right. That is a decision that is not made lightly. Again, documentation is required. If we're partway through a procedure and the patient has asked us to stop, we must stop, okay? And the withdrawal of the consent is documented with the details as far as why the patient has decided to withdraw, okay? The consent itself. It could be pain-based. It could be just lots of different reasons, okay? All relevant information is provided to the patient so that the decision to withdraw is also considered an informed decision, okay? And that's why it's very important to make sure that the patient understands what they are consenting to prior to starting the procedure, okay? All right? Please don't omit any information, and we're going to talk about later on sort of the details of procedures such as pain versus discomfort, okay? Pressure versus nerve sensations and things like that. So that'll be in the semester to come. But those are particular details that a patient really wants to know. Is this going to hurt or not? Okay. So what happens here? What's the MRT's role? Okay. So the MRT should be familiar with the facility's consent policy and the legislation, okay, of their province. Part of the MRT's role is to ensure that the informed consent has been granted for the procedure that's going to be done. So what it sometimes happens is that as the patient is told to come in for this particular procedure, the radiologist will have a look at perhaps previous exams or other clinical history, and then they'll say, okay, well, no, we need to do this procedure instead. Okay, that change or modification in the procedure needs to actually be documented, and the consent that the patient signed needs to be changed, okay, over from that per se, okay? If a patient does not have the accurate information, for instance, okay, accurate information, provided it's beyond the MRT's scope or competence to provide that information, please refrain, as I just mentioned earlier, from just sort of filling in the blanks, okay, all right? We need to make sure that the patient is signing off exactly the procedure that's being done, okay? As far as documenting the consent, consent is documented according to the institutional and provincial requirements. Consent to treat is an ongoing process, not a form, all right? Please keep the consent simple, okay? The writing, the language, the explanation, okay, all right? Keep in mind, a lot of these patients are already quite anxious, okay, or nervous about having this procedure done. So you need to take the time to explain the procedure so that they can understand it. And if that means you have to explain it 3 times, you explain it 3 times. Keep in mind, there are patients, of course, too, who do quite a bit of lip reading. So if you have someone who's hard of hearing, and if we are providing a consent with a mask on, it's harder to hear, as well as it's not as easy to sort of give that explanation with a mask on. Okay, all right. So just be a little bit mindful when you are giving the explanation, and if you have a mask on, what that was like to the patient themselves. Okay, all right. So there are questions in regards to this the CAMRT consent, the informed consent, that I'd like you to complete and make sure that you understand, so that we can confidently say that an informed or written consent is an important document that needs to be dealt with very professionally. Okay, all right. Thank you.